Because we have this very narrow window of opportunity to change the status quo. And when changes in status quo come, they often do not come from a mainstream opposition party. They come from a party that is not involved, that nobody is really thinking about, but actually has the space to start and, in a way, moderate and get involved in a conversation that the main parties just can't. So when I thought about this, I thought, okay, there's a couple of years, I think, where we've got a lot of turbulence and people will be looking for something new. And that's why I took this job, because I want to be part of that.
Well, let's focus in on your flagship policy then, universal basic income, one of the biggest changes you're proposing. Very simply, could you explain what universal basic income is and then why we need it?
It is an annual payment to every person in the country, even children. And that is tax-free. So in 2020 numbers, it was set at $13,000 per year, which was around $250 a week, which matched the kind of supported living payment, so the basic benefit level, but everybody gets it, and that's the key thing. So it's universal, and it's at its fundamental level, it recognizes the value and dignity of everybody, and recognizes the huge contribution that many people make outside normal paid income, in terms of caring, supporting, all the bits that go on in our community. I mean, it's valued around 25% of GDP. It's a big number. And of that, probably 75-80% is done by women. So it has huge gender issues as well. But it's a much more efficient way of putting purchasing power into society. So it's a fundamental change in how we view people, their contribution, their value, as opposed to a welfare system which is just out of date, which was great in the 1930s, but it's laborious, treats people poorly, there's so much red tape, and even the people who actually oversee it often say, look, this thing needs to change.
Let's just rattle through the obvious pushbacks to UBI. How much is that going to cost a year and how are you going to fund it?
So again, 2020 numbers, we are updating those for next year. The cost was around 35 billion, which is a big number.
Enormous.
Now, traditionally what people have said is they've stopped there and said, okay, we can't afford a UBI. And probably we can't. Tax rates would have to be 50, 55% plus. Now, that doesn't necessarily rule it out, because of course that money is all.
So you're just saying we probably can't afford a UBI?
If there's nothing on the other side. So in terms of funding it, and this is where the tax policy comes in, we will tax housing properly, which we do not do at the moment. And we will institute a flat tax. At the moment, it's 33%. So all income gets taxed at 33%, including company profits, which are currently at 28%. PIEs, trusts, everything on the same level. Now that will bring in the money to support the UBI.
Right.
So it's a huge tax switch we're talking about here. But for most people down here, people on median incomes and below will benefit, and they'll benefit to the tune of, $13,000 to $5,000 in terms of an improvement in their take-home pay. People, as you go above the median, yes, probably will benefit a little bit, and then up here, people will pay more tax. So on a sort of individual level, it's not a huge number, but when you look at it at a macro level, it's a big number. Yeah, sure.
I think a lot of people listening to that would just hear you want to put everyone on what is functionally the maximum tax rate of 33% to try and pay for this.
All income is taxed at 33%, not the first $13,000. So that's tax-free. Then everything you earn above that is at 33%. So we get rid of all the abatements. We get rid of whether you work an extra hour and your marginal tax rate is 80 or 90%. All of that goes out the window. Now, normally a flat tax would not be seen as particularly progressive. But with the UBI attached to it, it is.
Right. Yeah. And we're also currently experiencing historically high inflation levels globally. Yeah. How would pumping this much money into people's pockets not just make that worse?
Because financially, it's neutral. There's no extra money coming in. So actually, it makes no difference at all.
The other pushback that people usually have on UBI is that wouldn't this just be a disincentive for people to go out and work?
Yeah. No. I mean, let's be clear about this. The beneficiary bashing, this kind of dependency thing. I heard a term bottom feeding the other day. It's got to stop. I mean, I think that's been sitting over us for the last 30 years, and it's been appalling. It has discriminated against people who are often, dealing with structural issues around their lives, structural poverty, historical issues, and all the research shows that actually, if you treat people with dignity, they actually go out and make something of their lives. That's the reality. The research is there, and it's something that we kind of know instinctively to be true. But the way that certain people have portrayed people on benefits without giving them a lot of choices is terrible, and that needs to stop.
But looking internationally, UBI has actually been trialled in several places. Finland had the largest trial, but they ended it after 2 years and don't currently have plans to continue. If this is such a good idea, why hasn't it been taken up by places like Finland? Because
it takes courage. I mean, it takes courage to say, we're going to do things differently. Now, a lot of the trials that have been done, they've been very small. They've been like kind of normal small groups, particularly in a way terms of reference around them. They haven't been kind of that universal. So they've picked a group of people and they've done it like any kind of, psychological trial, social experiment. And generally what we see is that the health outcomes, mental health outcomes are really good. Like there was a piece in the New York Times recently about mothers and their children and mental health outcomes from direct cash transfers for them, which was very, very positive. Now, doing a trial for 1 or 2 years is not going to really tell you that much. It's going to confirm whatever bias you bring to it anyway. I mean, I'll take you back 500 years, not to Thomas More and Utopia, but to a social researcher, Joan de Vives, who was researching, I believe in Bruges, issues around poverty. And he went and he did all the investigations, the research, why are people down and out, why are people in debtors' prisons, why can't people actually make stuff happen? And in the end he goes, it's a really simple conclusion. People need money. People need money to do things. When you have money, then you can take care of everything else. Then you can make investments. Then you can kind of start to think, okay, how can I improve my life? You can study. You can start a business. But when you're constantly struggling to live, the impact on people is devastating often. And then we expect them to kind of do good things.
And as you've pointed out, this is not a new idea, and it's been suggested by everyone from Richard Nixon to Martin Luther King. But the fact that it's been suggested by so many people over so long, yet never eventuated, doesn't that just speak to its political infeasibility?
Well, I mean, Nixon is a good example because he got very close to bringing it in with, I think, a family tax credit, negative income tax. Clinton talked about a negative income tax, but it's never politically quite got there. A little bit like land taxes, when we talk about that. They've been around for a long time, and just over time, the big money in politics, certainly the conservative side of things, and to some extent, sometimes even the Labour side, who are focused on, people who are working.
Yes.
And then you get all these, so who's fighting for them? Who's talking for humanity in general terms? We know what big money is going to talk about. It's preserving their interests, which is exactly what we have now. And Labour, and look here, the Future of Work programme, and they basically said, no, we're not going to look at a UBI. Because again, there's a lot of people in that area who think, no, you have to get out and work. Well, there's a lot of work going on. You just don't even paying for it.
Right. And last thing, just on the nitty-gritty of the UBI. I know you're adjusting the figures, but at around $13,000 a year, that's just around the basic benefit level. Isn't there a danger we're just spreading this money too thinly? It's not going to be enough to radically change the lives of low-income earners, and it will be relatively inconsequential to higher-income earners.
Well, no, because I mean, one of the arguments is, why are you giving it to people who don't need it? Well, we're going to tax that back off them. It's going to be very consequential to people at the bottom end and people on low.
But it's still hovering around the same level of traditional benefits, $250 a week. In some cases, it'll be lower as Labour raises.
Yeah, so in a way, if you think about it, there's almost three groups. There's people who are working, will get it. There's people who would be on benefits who get it, but they don't have to troop down to WINS every week to justify that they're looking for work or whatever. They can actually sit back and think about stuff. And people who are doing huge contributions in our community, in society, get it. So actually for them, it's extremely consequential. So I mean, that's the universal aspect of it. Now, there were people who might argue, well, the targeted system's working very well. Well, actually, it's not. And if you speak to anyone who's involved in it, I've seen it at a personal level, working with people, dealing with MSD, dealing with WINS, dealing with ACC. It's a circus, So we get rid of all of that stuff. And then we deal with the real issues. People who need extra help, people with disabled children, and people who are caring for people who are sick. You know, they're often left out of things. They need a bit more focus.
Just to be clear, it's going to replace 250 up to
Yeah,
250 hours of weight, but it won't completely replace extra benefits on top
There'll
of
still
that.
be other stuff, And when we look at like working families or the child benefit, they kind of cancel each other out. So we'll kind of look at which is the best one.
Right.
But actually making life a lot easier for people in terms of the administrative aspects of it. And making sure that that purchasing power is down here. It's all going to get spent. So essentially, I mean, there are a lot of arguments that the size of the spend will bring good outcomes as well, particularly for communities in terms of growth in that particular economy, as opposed to, you know, as we've seen in the last couple of years, like purchase of luxury goods, because people got so much money. Because essentially we have a system which is trickle up, not trickle down.
And just lastly on UBI, one of the common arguments for it, which you've made yourself, is that the coming wave of automation is going to replace so many jobs that we have to radically rethink our economy. But I'm just wondering if you could point to any examples of automation actually replacing widespread jobs, because I can't really see much evidence for that.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that futurists have talked about, say, by 2030, this will happen. Now, do we
I think 1 billion jobs by 2030 is the
it was, I think, I mean, we see automation in factories. We see automation that is starting to appear, and it's not yet having massive impacts. Now, in a way, on the other side of that, we're seeing jobs becoming a lot more precarious. We're seeing people in essentially the gig economy. We're seeing a rise of 0-hour contracts. So people are working, people are employed, and the employment numbers we get show unemployment at a low level, but that will be measuring people who are working an hour a week. So how many people are fully employed? How many people are in jobs which pay well, that have appropriate benefits? And how many people are on the edges of this automation change? And it's very difficult to see. I mean, we're seeing supermarkets that are potentially going dark in that they're holding stock, but actually there's not many people in there operating it. So I think this is likely to accelerate over the next 5 to 10 years. That makes the importance of community, you know, at a higher demand in terms of the more spend we put into local areas, the better. And that ultimately comes from people who are in their local community, day in, day out, supporting that.
Sure, I guess just the final point on this one though is that automation seems to always be just around the corner. It's one of the oldest fears that we have. It's this economic boogeyman that we've been afraid of for hundreds of years, but never actually gets here. So do you think it's sort of losing its potency as an argument for UBI?
Not really, because I think perhaps it's about reframing it in terms of, so yes, we think the Jetsons will be traveling around. Well, someone's got to make these things. What I notice, and it's not just in retail sectors or manufacturing sectors, but even in professional sectors, a lot of jobs are just starting to go, even in the public sector. And there's a lot of jobs in, you know, we always think down at those lower levels, but in kind of middle management levels, professionals, you see a lot of people now exiting careers in their 40s and 50s.
Do we have any hard numbers for this sort of stuff? It's all very anecdotal.
Yeah, no, it is definitely. I mean, it's certainly something I've observed, that there's not that many jobs left at these high levels because there is a contraction. There's a lot of people consulting. So in a way, the gig economy is everywhere. And, you know, that is powered by certain changes. It's powered by the way the public sector operates. You could argue that inefficiencies, you know, are generally applied to people down on minimum wages. So if that starts to percolate upwards, you could see some challenges. But yeah, it is a slightly ethereal thing. For me, the automation is about precarious jobs. It's the gig economy and the fact that people need something to fall back on. The UBI for me at a larger scale is about human dignity and making sure people have got the basics, whatever happens. I mean, we saw with COVID, wage subsidies, you know, a lot of that went to big business. You know, now if we had a slightly different system, that money might have been going in down here and not so much up there. Sorry, big business, you have to take some of the pain as well. Instead, we've got record corporate profits. We've got $1 trillion of new wealth for owners of property and companies. Meanwhile, everyone down here is scratching around. And kids, I mean, again, it's anecdotal, but because we don't have data on this, but yeah, kids not going to school. Now, so people I speak to in the education sector are going, we're seeing roles down. And that is because a lot of kids are not coming back to do, say, year 13 because they're out working. And they're working in kind of part-time jobs. They're grabbing shifts here and here. So yeah, all of that, I mean, in a way, we're going through this shift. It's not easy to see. So yeah.
Okay, well, let's talk about property and tax specifically and wealth. Housing is another massive area in terms of your policy proposals. Could you just point to the first and most urgent action that TOP would perform in order to address the housing crisis?
Yeah, we'd introduce, a tax on property. Now, the previous policy had been a tax on equity in the property. Wasn't particularly well received. My favourite approach is a land value tax. It's been around again, 150 years. It's in use in places. It's basically, it focuses on the efficient and productive use of land, but it also captures the increase in rent from land increasing in value. And generally, land increases in value due to investment in public infrastructure, zoning laws, and a lot of that is reflected in the price of a house. So when people talk about house prices going up, actually it's land prices going up. And so we would institute probably roughly a 1% annual land value tax. We think that will bring in around $10 billion a year. So pretty much matches previous numbers that we had. And so that's the revenue. So yeah, that's going to be an immediate input.
I mean, any time people hear this, all they hear is capital gains tax. Could you just make it very clear and explicit how your proposal differs from a capital gains tax?
Yeah, the capital gains tax is essentially a tax you pay when you realise the sale of an asset. And of course, that's one of the problems with capital gains tax is you may never get it. And there's lots of ways of structuring even the ownership of a house, which means you never actually sell it. But essentially, you buy a house, let's say for, well, these days, I don't know, $1 million, and you sell it for 1.5 million, and you pay a tax on that. You pay a tax on that gain. So let's say you pay a 33% tax, be 150 grand, for example. Now, you've got your $1.5 million house. The land value is about $1 million. It's roughly about 2/3, and you pay a 1% annual land charge on that, which would be $10,000 a year. So in some respects, it's not an exact science because of course capital gains tax depends very much on when you purchase something. So bringing in a capital gains tax now at the peak, at a 30-year peak, prices might not go up from here. So those gains will just sit. And again, it will be gamed in terms of tax. An annual tax charge is something that just gets charged every single year. Land prices go down, you pay less. Land prices go up, you pay more. But it's a regular charge.
I guess the point being with why I bring up capital gains tax is the most popular prime minister in a generation was unable to meaningfully reform tax and housing. So there just clearly isn't much of an appetite for it in New Zealand. How would you sell this to New Zealanders?
I think to me, I was shocked by that, really, given it had been Labour's a flagship policy for a long time. We presume, but we don't know, that it was killed by New Zealand First. That should have been out in the open. To be honest, they should have kicked New Zealand First out of government.
You think Winston should have been kicked out of government if that was the case?
Absolutely.
But that's just political wheeling and dealing.
Of course it is.
Right?
Yeah. But
you can't kick Winston out for that.
But I think, well, why not? But I think, well, actually you could, because if you read his speeches after he got in, it was all about changing the system, restructuring the system, dealing to capitalism, dealing to neoliberalism, and then he did nothing. So, to me, that's see you later.
Okay, well, this is a good segue into democratic reset if you're thinking big picture changes. Can you just tell me what you mean by New Zealand needs a new social contract? This is one of your big policy pitches. Very simply, what does that mean?
What it means is that the status quo system we've got, which is really the last 25, 30 years of MMP, but essentially two major parties, is not really delivering the changes that we need. So we tend to have a status quo, and it's 9 years of Labour, 9 years of National, 6 years of Labour, and everyone can complain about the previous one beforehand. The 5% threshold is anti-democratic and highly distortionary. The Royal Commission on Electoral Reform looked at it. They recommended move that to 4%. We think get rid of it altogether. And if you're going to have a proper democracy, have a proper democracy. And set the threshold at a seat threshold. For me,
so what's that in sort of percentages, like 0.8 or what's that?
0.8. I think about 40,000. The social contract for me is really as part of this democracy reset, which can look at things like a written constitution, can look at things like a bicameral Parliament, so an upper house, can look at things like citizens' assemblies, participatory budgeting, in a way trying to get people more engaged. But for me, the social contract is a sense of what does it mean to be a citizen in the 21st century? And I think that's something we need. We've got issues around social cohesion. How do we address that? So what I'm, this is really a discussion document more than anything, but I really want to see some form of national civic service offered to people when they leave school, focusing on, so it's not like the military service, but in some ways it's similar, except it's civic. So looking at civic and constitutional matters, looking at conservation, looking at community, and looking at civil defense. So actually providing our young people with skills and training in those areas. Now it might be just sort of 1 week modules that you can do here and there. It's funded by the state because we think this is what being a citizen is about. And it creates the opportunity for every kid to go through a similar, if you like, training around what does it mean to me to be a citizen? And everyone will have their own different views, but it tries to create some kind of togetherness, some kind of cohesion around what does it mean to be a Kiwi. So we've got the outdoors, we've got Outward Bound, we've got the Hillary Awards, so a bit of outdoors conservation, community. We've seen how the SVA have done such a great job. They brought a legacy on, so what does it mean to participate in your community? Civil defence, so disaster response on one hand, and we've seen that in Christchurch a lot through the earthquakes and even after the 15th of March attacks. And that might even include knowing how to fire a gun. We're a big hunting nation.
That's a very big sort of, that's a big picture, top-down approach that almost sort of tells people what it means to be a Kiwi. And what it means to be a Kiwi is different to many different groups.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, could you speak more specifically to what does a new social contract look like for Māori, for example, or for a historically marginalised group that are naturally, in some ways, justifiably suspicious that the government or the state is there to help them?
Well, in a way, the Māori piece is critical because in the civic and constitutional, and remember, it's not telling people what, it's actually offering kids the chance to take part in these areas that they may not have been exposed to. So yes, you might go on a school camp and you might do this, and you might do the Hillary Award, or you might be involved with your Rotary or Lions. The civic and constitutional bit, and it's fantastic that history has now been introduced into the curriculum, would look at things like, okay, well, how do we engage with the treaty? Now, clearly in a written constitution, that's where you'd have a lot of those conversations. What does it mean to be a citizen from a kind of political and civic perspective? And these are all highly debatable. And in a way, it kind of doesn't matter. It's just actually engaging people in that. So learning to have a debate about something, actually learning the history, learning what is the constitutional structure of the country. I mean, my worry, and the reason I've thought about this a lot, is what happened in the US. And which had its kind of roots in the global financial crisis.
And by what happened in the US, you mean January 6th?
Yeah, but it's been coming for a long time. And essentially it's been a failure of the major parties to deal with the underlying issues. I mean, we saw the Occupy movement after the global financial crisis. That, and people still suffering economically and financially from that, and they become lost. And we have that here a little bit. We know Māori have suffered for a long time. And we're very, optimistic that measures like the UBI will support Māori.
So just to be clear, you're saying that you think New Zealand is on a track towards where America is today?
I think if we don't address these issues, I really think we do. And I think what I see from the major parties is nothing. I really don't see anything. I think Labour, the most popular Prime Minister, who could talk about this stuff, no doubt about it, it's just kind of given up. Now maybe that'll change in the next 18 months. National, I don't see has a lot to offer. ACT are really the worry in terms of, I think they've imported a lot of stuff in the US.
You're calling out ACT for importing some ideas that you think are problematic from overseas. What did you mean by that?
Well, I'm seeing elements of the Tea Party, the alt-right, but this kind of constant theme that our institutions don't matter, and that our institutions are somehow corrupt, and this whole concept of freedom means doing away with everything, and it creates a huge distrust. And I think that's one of our big problems at the moment is trust, lack of trust in our institutions, lack of trust in our media. And I just see, whoa, this is where the US was, and Trump exploited that. Because he was somebody who essentially was a grifter, could make up stories, didn't really care what he said. It was just about capturing people's attention. And when people lose faith in the institutions that have been built up over a long time, you've got a big problem. So when we talk about a democracy reset, we need to actually pay attention to this stuff. And I think the recent protests should be a very strong message that we do need to think about that. Now, we know there are huge economic and financial issues here, and if we don't deal with them, we're going to have a problem.
And just lastly, the thing on this, but just because David Seymour's not here to defend himself, just to push back slightly. I mean, could you point, did you specifically mean that ACT, do you think, is flirting with alt-right ideas from America? And if so, could you point to one example of what you mean?
Look, for me, I mean, it sounds kind of a bit weird. It's a feeling. I mean, my observation of where politics has been going over the last, let's say, 5 to 10 years. This sense that we're going through an interregnum, this sense that the last 30 years of essentially what we would call neoliberalism, which is open markets, the dominance of capital is coming to an end. And we don't yet have a good vision. Now, I think TOP has a very strong vision in terms of putting people first, supporting people and communities, investing. You know, we haven't even talked about financial stuff, public debt levels, complete nonsense. So basically trying to change the shift from essentially an austerity corset that we've had since the early 90s. But for me, what is more disturbing from ACT, and it's not a personal thing, it's they're buying into this freedom thing, which is what we're seeing from the States, you know? And what they're actually doing is they're kind of trashing our institutions by causing a loss of trust in our institutions. Now, they might argue, well, they're not doing a good job. Great. I'd be happy to sit down with them and look at the public service and where they're spending money. But at a broader sense, from a psychological perspective, they're kind of feeding this beast. And that worries me.
Right. And on media, just in terms of trust in institutions, you've said that cringy red versus blue debates aren't actually public interest journalism. I mean, slightly self-serving question as someone who helps produce those debates.
Did I say that? I think it might be in a policy somewhere.
It's in top policy.
Yes,
but why do you think that a public journalism currently is cringy, or these left versus right debates are not helpful?
I think we need more diversity in the voices of people that we hear from. And I think politically, I mean, when we look at the, let's say, election campaigning and this idea that you have leaders debate and all this kind of stuff, it's all heavily structured. And I think it, in some respects, puts people off talking about new things. I mean, if we're going to have fundamental change, we need to discuss it openly. And if it's just, I mean, you know, Labour and National just going at each other the whole time, it's like this eternal psychodrama, you know? It's almost like a married couple arguing. And actually, hey, the kids want to have a say here, that actually we've got different things to say. And I'm, you know, a big believer in sunlight being the best disinfectant. So actually, let's get people in a position where they can debate stuff and they're interrogated on their claims, like you're doing now. And let's see what people have got to say. So broadening that conversation is very important. And I think it will help with, you know, I deal with media a lot, so I don't buy this idea that media is captured in any way. I don't think they are at all. But and in a way, that's part of the, again, probably from the right, this idea that, you know, there's corruption in the system. And that is a worry. Now, the way to address that is to address it head on. And that means that people being questioned means the Prime Minister sitting down for frank interviews, leader opposition, and leaders of the other parties. Now, of course, a small party that's not in Parliament, you kind of think, well, how much air should we give them? And they've got to prove they can get in. The 5% threshold makes that very difficult. So there's got to be a bit of give and take there. Otherwise, we'll just get the same stuff the whole time.
Just one specific proposal that you put forward in terms of media, though, is selling TVNZ
Yes.
and essentially putting all that money into public interest journalism fund for NZ On Air.
Yeah.
We already have a public journalism fund for NZ On Air, so I'm just wondering, specifically, how would that look, and why is it necessary to sell TVNZ?
Yeah, I mean, that policy is from 2020. That will be refreshed. I don't have a strong view on it.
Right.
So I'm open. I think we need a very strong media. It's the fourth estate. It holds government to account, as well as telling stories that matter to people. And my sense and experience from TVNZ and RNZ, culturally very different. So I would have liked to see TVNZ probably just go its own way. And then put some more money into public broadcasting, and maybe not try and compete in an area which is extremely expensive, such as television, but look for other ways to engage with people, and especially younger people are looking at stuff online anyway.
Right. Okay.
So building a stronger
Sure.
public broadcasting is important.
Just a quick few other policies before we finish up. Drug reform. What would you like to see? The cannabis referendum has failed. There doesn't seem to be a huge mandate. What would you do?
Well, I don't know. It's 50-50, really. And actually, if you look at a lot of the polling, it's probably more like 70-30. So some people want legalization, some people want decriminalization. I mean, our view's being reasonably straightforward is that, we want to reduce harm from drugs, end of story. And the police, chasing people with, a few cannabis plants, it's a waste of resources. And, this totally hits Māori populations more, and we've got to do something about that. It's a complete waste of resources. So, legalization, regulate it properly.
So legalize cannabis, and then I believe the policy statement, if this is still true from 2020, is just regulate all drugs based on harm. So what would that mean for something like ecstasy?
Same thing, same thing. And I think...
So legalization.
Yeah, why not? And then, for me, it's like, treat it as a kind of medical issue. I mean, we have alcohol out there, and we really do nothing about it. And the harm caused by alcohol is huge. Just go and visit A&E on a Saturday night.
So you do propose putting a 10% further tax on alcohol. Is that still a proposal you take forward?
I mean, if you think about the recommendations of the Law Commission, that was probably the most critical one, which was the, sustainable price.
You're going to piss off a lot of Kiwis who, by telling them they're going to pay more for pints. I don't know if it's going to be the most popular policy.
Well, we're not here entirely to be popular. We're here to make good policy as well, and also try and have conversations with people. I mean, we want to get away from polarized views about everything. It's sit down and say, okay, well, why don't you like this? Talk to people about it. And often when you talk to people about it, they come out with a different position. But we are so used to kind of the quick fire response. No, that's rubbish. That's not going to work. And then you say, well, and this is the bit I enjoy about politics, is saying, well, what do you think would work? Or how are we going to solve this problem? And often when you allow people to come into that conversation, you get different outcomes. And that's why kind of the disengagement of people from the political process is a real worry, because they go off elsewhere. And that means they're open to capture by people who might have different outcomes in mind.
Right. And one of the other slightly more controversial proposals that you put forward is that New Zealand has a backwards approach to gene editing currently, and we should really radically rethink our current approach and stance on genetic modification and gene editing. Could you just explain TOP's proposal here?
Yeah, I mean, we should. I mean, fortunately, our spokesperson on this is a biochemist, and very excited about this field. I mean, if you think back to the 2001 Electoral Commission, it was like, let's keep up to date with what's happening in science. Science is moving a lot. So when we talk about gene editing, it's not the same as GMO. So it's not introducing or transgenic modification. It's actually editing genes that are already there. Now, this happens already, and there's probably food that we eat that's coming from overseas, but it can help in the health field with particular diseases. It can help with agriculture. It has lots of opportunities. So I think our approach is give the EPA good oversight, regulatory powers, but let's be more open to this, and let's start actually taking a science-first approach.
So do you think currently it's just more of a moral issue? We're stuck in a historic sort of stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, science changes all the time.
Yeah.
And there's stuff that we do today that we wouldn't have done 10 years ago or 20 years ago. Look at where all these vaccines came very quickly. Actually, let's not talk about the vaccines. But
You've got good political instincts. Look at you.
Essentially, it's a science-first approach. Yeah. So let's have the frameworks, which means that as the science changes, we've got brilliant scientists here. Let's see what we can do.
What about the critics who'd say New Zealand's got an international trading reputation around clean, green, all natural food, that we might be putting that at risk?
Well, I don't. I think a lot of people take that with a slight pinch of salt. Look, I mean, I think our products, we're going up the quality scale. Now, there's no reason that gene editing can't be part of that. So it doesn't have to change our brand. It's how we approach it is the key issue. And we can attract scientists here, or we can be part of overseas science, but it's taking science as the first approach. And we can be as precautionary as we like, but we should still be doing the work.
I know you've touched on it there, but just last thing on gene editing, could you just more specifically point to one or two issues that you think it could help solve? That's just to make it practical and real for Kiwis watching.
Cystic fibrosis, muscular dystrophy. So obviously, genetic health issues. There's a lot of work going on in that space. I'm not an expert on that, but I'm told there are great opportunities there. In the agricultural field, potentially dealing with things like, kari dieback, introducing organisms, that can help change those negative outcomes.
So it's a very broad application, and while there are some things we know we could use it for, we also just don't know what things we could use it for, so we should find out.
Yeah, so food. Fabric and materials, microplastics in water, So I think let's actually just do the work before we say we're introducing stuff.
Right. And finally, Raf, thank you for sitting down. It's been a long interview with a couple of breaks. I guess anyone watching this might be thinking, well, I like the sound of some of these policies or not, but what do you say to someone watching that says, I like some of the things you say, but a vote for top is a wasted vote because the chances of you getting in are historically not great?
Yeah. In the last election, I think the votes that didn't count, so let's not call them wasted votes, was around 8%. So that speaks to a dysfunction at the heart of our democracy, which needs to be changed, and I would have hoped someone like Jacinda Ardern would have done that. That hasn't happened.
So specifically, what do you mean by that 8% didn't count?
Because it didn't meet the 5% threshold.
Right, so all the votes for those minor parties outside,
they just vanish. And then they essentially redistributed. Well, they're not redistributed, but basically the pool closes. That's sad, because we want people to vote. And then people are going, well, I voted and it didn't matter. And that's not a wasted vote, because it's still recorded. I would say to people, if we're going to deal with the issues of social cohesion, of poor outcomes for too many people, we need a strong centre. So I would say to people, vote for us and get us into Parliament. Because if you don't, we're going to keep getting the same result.
You're on the fourth leader now, though, for top. I mean, it's a long shot getting you back in. This might be your last shot. What mistakes kept top out of Parliament previously, and what are you going to do differently now?
Well, if we look at, briefly, 2017, Gareth came in, fire and brimstone, again, only 6 months before the election, did really well, captured, public interest, didn't get the debates. That made a huge difference. If you're not there in the TV, in front of people, in the debates, it has a huge problem. So that shows the impact that media has. So 2.5%, great effort, he had enough. But it certainly provoked a lot of people to start thinking about things like UBI, taxing housing properly. Then the party went through some changes as Gareth left, decided, probably quite late on, let's have a go at 2020. Jeff, who'd been deputy leader, stepped in, did a great job, but because of COVID, again, had no cut through, didn't get a lot of media coverage. Actually, most people didn't meet each other because of the lockdown. So, for a small party, that lockdown was just a bit of a nightmare. And then, but again, they kept getting new people coming to them. So even though it wasn't reflected in the voting, I've had so many people say to me, I would vote for top if I thought they'd get in. So how do you deal with that? Okay. So essentially, we've got to be polling at, say, 3% and above. And then I think people go, okay.
By when?
By the end of the year.
3% by the end of the year?
At least, yeah. I mean, we have to be at 3% by the end of the year.
Sure.
Otherwise, you might think, maybe this isn't going to work. So last year was a bit of a holding pattern. Jeff had done his dash, and I'm here now. And I took this on because I believe it's of critical importance. It's as simple as that. If we don't do this now, then we're in for a rough ride.
What do you say to the criticism some people have brought up that Top has a bit of a sense of talking down to some voters, or that they're the smartest guys in the room, and then if only you had a PhD in economics, you'd learn that the universal basic income was the right way to go. What do you say to that perception around Top?
I think that's fair, and I think it's something that we're changing. And I think, I've been a politician at a local level. You get to talk to people in a very different way. And I think, Top has a bit of a kind of, had a bit of a smartest guys in the room thing. We're going to change that. I mean, we've got to win the hearts and minds of people, which means we've got to change our language. We don't have the answers to everything. I think we've got some big policies that will provide the structural change that New Zealand needs to be a fairer society and provide opportunities for all. That's really what it's about. But I also think that we can play a part in government, in collaborating with other people, and essentially taking New Zealand forward.
Last word to you, why vote Top?
Because we're going to make a change. That's it. I mean, we're going to change the status quo. I mean, we're not here to be in Parliament. I'm not here to be a minister. We are here to make structural change.
Well, you have to. The only way you can make structural change is to get into Parliament.
Yeah, and that's why I'm here. So I can write about this, talk about this, write books, write papers. It doesn't matter. As we've seen, unless you've got your hands on the steering wheel, you can't effect a change of direction. And that's what we need to do. Otherwise, we're going to be stuck with the same national Labour status quo that we've had for the last 20 years.
Raf, thank you very much.
Thank you.